The courtroom was silent, yet every whisper of movement seemed amplified, bouncing off the high ceilings and the ornate walls that had witnessed centuries of royal history. Cameras lined the gallery, flashes ready to ignite. But in that moment, the air was thick with tension, and all eyes were fixed on the woman who had stepped into the storm she had long sought to navigate with poise and power. Queen Camilla, usually composed, her demeanor carefully curated for decades of public scrutiny, appeared almost fragile as she made her way to the witness stand. Her hands, gloved in pale leather, trembled ever so slightly, betraying the inner turmoil that no royal protocol could conceal. Outside, the press had begun murmuring, the collective murmur growing into a roar that threatened to drown out the quiet dignity of the proceedings within. This was no ordinary day in the monarchy's history. This was a moment that could alter the very narrative the world had believed for over 3 decades. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. At the heart of this drama was Prince Edward, the youngest child of Queen Elizabeth II, a man known for his diplomacy and measured demeanor. But today, he carried the weight of truth like a sword poised to pierce decades of carefully constructed secrecy. Edward had spent months, if not years, quietly gathering evidence, corroborating stories, and preparing for a day he knew would redefine the public perception of his family. He had not done this lightly, nor without the full understanding of the storm it would unleash. When he rose to deliver his testimony, the room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the words that could shatter not only Camilla's composure, but also the myths that had surrounded the tragic death of Princess Diana. The stakes could not have been higher. For decades, the world had mourned Diana, the people's princess, whose life and death had captivated the globe, who had inspired millions with her compassion, yet had been ensnared in a web of relentless media scrutiny. Her final night in Paris, a night forever etched into public memory, had been the subject of countless investigations, theories, and speculations. Yet, as the cameras captured every inch of the courtroom, Edward prepared to unveil evidence suggesting that Diana's tragic end was not merely the result of fate or reckless driving, but of deliberate orchestration, allegedly with Queen Camilla's involvement. The very notion sent a shiver through the press and the spectators alike. Could it be true that Camilla had secretly coordinated with the paparazzi, feeding them the exact movements of Diana, ensuring she was relentlessly pursued on that fateful night? From the opening moments, the story that had been whispered, speculated, and hinted at in hushed tones within palace corridors was now emerging in full force. Edward's words carried a weight that no rumor or innuendo ever could. "The truth," he began, his voice steady yet piercing, "is not a matter of opinion or interpretation. It is a matter of evidence, and the evidence speaks." The room was spellbound. Reporters scribbled furiously, noting every gesture, every inflection, every moment that hinted at the gravity of what was unfolding. Camilla's face, usually a mask of composure, betrayed fleeting flashes of panic, her eyes darting toward the gallery and then to the bench as if seeking reassurance that was not coming. For the first time in public, the woman who had carefully navigated decades of royal life was forced into vulnerability, her secrets laid bare under the unforgiving glare of the court. The narrative Edward unfolded was meticulous. He presented documents, photographs, and accounts that traced Diana's movements in Paris with unprecedented detail. Every stop, every interaction, every moment of pursuit by the media was mapped with precision. He suggested, with chilling clarity, that the information which enabled the relentless chase was not coincidental. It had allegedly been funneled through channels that led directly back to Camilla, a revelation that sent ripples through the legal teams, the press, and the public. Imagine the youngest son of the Queen standing firm against a figure who had once been seen as untouchable, exposing a web of deception that could redefine the royal legacy. Questions hung in the air, unspoken but palpable. If these allegations were true, what did it mean for the monarchy? For Camilla herself? For the world's understanding of one of the most tragic events of the 20th century? The courtroom became a theater of tension, every glance, every gesture magnified. As Edward continued, he detailed interactions with paparazzi, timelines of communications, and evidence suggesting that Diana's privacy had been systematically compromised in ways previously unknown. The implications were staggering. It was no longer a tale of tragedy and misfortune. It was a story of potential betrayal from within, a hidden hand shaping events that had captured global attention and heartbreak. Outside, the public followed with rapt attention. Social media buzzed with speculation and outrage. News outlets paused other stories to cover the unfolding drama, broadcasting live feeds from the courtroom. Viewers around the world witnessed the rare spectacle of royal secrets being laid bare, a narrative twist that no one had fully anticipated. Editorial boards scrambled to contextualize Edward's revelations, while commentators debated the potential ramifications for Camilla's position as queen and the integrity of the monarchy itself. For the public, it was an awakening. A confrontation with a version of history that had been carefully curated, now challenged in the most dramatic fashion possible. The emotional gravity was not lost on anyone in the room. Camilla's composure, trained over decades of public life, wavered under the weight of the accusations. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was tentative, fragile, tinged with panic, each word a desperate attempt to reclaim control of a narrative rapidly slipping from her grasp. Every answer she gave was scrutinized, every pause analyzed by legal teams and journalists alike. The juxtaposition of Edward's steadfast delivery against Camilla's unraveling demeanor amplified the tension to near unbearable levels. The public, conditioned to see royalty as above reproach, now confronted a deeply human drama of accountability, secrecy, and consequence. Edward's testimony was punctuated by moments of silence that spoke louder than words. He presented the evidence methodically, connecting dots that had remained obscured for decades. The allegations were not merely about personal failings or ethical lapses. They spoke to a pattern of deliberate influence over media coverage, a manipulation of events that, if proven true, altered the narrative of Diana's final hours irrevocably. The courtroom became a stage where history, legacy, and truth collided, and the audience, both inside and outside, watched with bated breath, aware that what unfolded could reshape not only the perception of Camilla, but also the very story of Diana's life and tragic death. The stakes extended beyond the courtroom. Monarchists and critics alike understood that this was a turning point. For decades, the image of the royal family had been carefully managed, their histories sanitized, their controversies contained. Yet here, in a moment of unprecedented transparency, a member of the family was willing to confront the past openly, bringing allegations into the public eye that had long been shrouded in speculation. It was a confrontation with truth, however painful, however destabilizing, and it demanded attention. By the end of the morning session, the atmosphere was electric. Camilla sat quietly, her hands folded, eyes downcast, every movement a testament to the pressure she was under. Edward's evidence had laid bare a narrative that the world had long suspected in whispers, but had never witnessed articulated with such precision and authority. The room buzzed with tension, the press poised to relay every detail to a captivated global audience. It was a story of betrayal, secrecy, and consequence, the ramifications of which would echo far beyond the walls of the courtroom. As the session adjourned for a brief recess, one could sense the magnitude of what was unfolding. The media swarmed, reporters vying for glimpses, reactions, and interpretations. Social media exploded with commentary, speculation, and disbelief. The royal family, traditionally insulated from public scrutiny, now faced an unprecedented challenge, reconciling decades of carefully managed appearances with the stark and dramatic testimony of Prince Edward. The world watched, riveted, as history itself seemed to pivot in real time. The truth of a fateful night in Paris emerging from decades of shadows into the unforgiving light of court scrutiny. The introduction to this story sets the stage for a narrative of intrigue, tension, and emotional depth. It is not merely a recounting of events, but an exploration of the complex interplay of power, secrecy, and consequence. As the courtroom drama continues to unfold, viewers are drawn into a story that challenges perceptions, evokes empathy, and demands reflection on what loyalty, morality, and justice mean when entwined with legacy, ambition, and the weight of history. The stage is set, the players revealed, and the consequences looming. What follows will challenge everything the public believed they knew about that fateful night, and the role of Queen Camilla in a story that has haunted generations. The air inside the courtroom was electric, thick with anticipation, tension, and the silent knowledge that history was being made. Every eye was fixed on the woman who had walked into the chamber with her usual measured composure. Yet something was different this day. Queen Camilla, a figure of poise and experience, had always navigated the treacherous waters of public scrutiny with calculated grace, but now, as she stood in the center of the room, that composure wavered. Her normally steady hands, gloved in pale leather, betrayed a subtle tremor, betraying the storm of anxiety and fear that roiled beneath the surface. The whispers of the press outside were relentless, yet inside, in the hushed confines of the court, each sound seemed magnified, every creak of the floorboards or shuffle of papers resonating like a drumbeat of inevitability. Prince Edward, the youngest child of Queen Elizabeth II, had taken the stand moments before, his presence commanding yet unassuming, a man who had spent years quietly gathering the pieces of a puzzle that many thought unsolvable. Today, however, he was not the polite royal we were accustomed to seeing in official photographs or charity events. Today, he was a man armed with the truth, prepared to confront not just his own family but the world itself with allegations that could shake the monarchy to its very core. For decades, the death of Princess Diana had been shrouded in mystery, speculation, and countless conspiracy theories. Her final night in Paris had been dissected by journalists, investigated by authorities, and mourned by millions across the globe. Yet, what Edward was about to reveal suggested that there had been forces at play, hidden for 30 years, forces that may have contributed directly to the fatal events that had claimed her life. As Edward began to speak, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. His voice, steady and precise, cut through the tense atmosphere, commanding attention without raising its volume. "The evidence I am about to present," he said, "is not speculation, rumor, or conjecture. It is supported by documents, communications, and first-hand accounts. And it points to actions taken by Queen Camilla that had direct consequences on the events leading to Diana's tragic death." The words landed like stones, rippling through the courtroom and into the hearts of everyone present. The press jostled for position, their cameras capturing every expression, every fleeting movement, every flicker of emotion on Camilla's face. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, seemed to search for some invisible reassurance, some anchor in a storm she could no longer control. The story that unfolded was both shocking and meticulously detailed. Edward presented evidence suggesting that Camilla had, in fact, coordinated with paparazzi on the night of Diana's fatal car chase. Every stop Diana made in Paris had allegedly been relayed through channels controlled or influenced by Camilla, ensuring that photographers could track her movements with precision. The implications were staggering. What had long been considered a tragic accident now took on the hue of deliberate orchestration, a manipulation of circumstances that may have placed Diana in danger. The courtroom was silent, save for the clicking of pens, the rustle of papers, and the occasional intake of breath as journalists and observers absorbed the gravity of what was being revealed. The narrative Edward laid out was painstakingly methodical. He spoke of intercepted communications, timelines of movements, and corroborated eyewitness accounts that painted a picture of relentless pursuit. Every detail suggested that Diana had been watched, her every step calculated and exposed, the freedom she once enjoyed stripped away by forces she may never have seen coming. For the public, the allegations were almost unimaginable. Camilla, who had long been a subject of both public fascination and private suspicion, was now facing accusations that could fundamentally alter the perception of her role in history. What had been whispered in palace corridors, speculated upon in tabloids, and hinted at in biographies was now being aired in a forum that demanded accountability, transparency, and truth. As Edward continued, he described the meticulous planning and coordination that allegedly allowed paparazzi to anticipate Diana's every move. Every street she drove down, every moment she paused, every encounter she had was traced with alarming precision. The evidence suggested that this was no random coincidence, no mere chance. Rather, it pointed to a deliberate effort to ensure that the media could pursue her relentlessly, capturing images that would eventually circulate worldwide. The courtroom was captivated, the air thick with disbelief and the sense that a veil long obscuring a dark chapter of royal history was being lifted. Camilla's reaction was subtle but telling. Her hands, previously steady, now fidgeted with her gloves, and the faintest quiver of her lips betrayed the anxiety beneath her carefully maintained facade. Her normally sharp, practiced expressions seemed to falter, replaced by fleeting flashes of fear and vulnerability. The world had long viewed her as a figure of poise and strategic composure, but in this moment, stripped of the protections afforded by distance and protocol, she appeared almost human, subject to the same fear, shame, and tension that the rest of us would feel under such scrutiny. Outside the courtroom, the public and media reacted in real time. Social media platforms erupted with speculation, outrage, and disbelief. News outlets paused other coverage to report on Edward's revelations, broadcasting live feeds and dissecting every statement, every piece of evidence presented. Experts in law, media, and royal affairs were consulted for their opinions, and public discourse became dominated by questions that had remained unasked for decades. Could Camilla have had a hand in orchestrating the events leading to Diana's death? What did this mean for the monarchy, for history, and for justice itself? The story that had once been told as tragedy was now reframed as a narrative of potential betrayal, manipulation, and concealed motives. In the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Edward's methodical presentation left little room for doubt, each piece of evidence adding to a growing mosaic of suspicion and accusation. He referenced communications, financial records, and corroborating testimony from individuals connected to both the royal family and media networks. Each revelation was a hammer strike, chipping away at the narrative of innocence and chance that had long surrounded the night of Diana's death. Camilla, once untouchable, was now under intense scrutiny, every response analyzed for inconsistencies, every pause interpreted as either guilt or strategic calculation. The weight of history bore down on her, and for the first time in decades, the public witnessed a moment where her carefully constructed image wavered. This was more than a courtroom drama. It was a reckoning. For Edward, it was a pursuit of truth and accountability, a chance to illuminate actions and consequences that had remained hidden for far too long. For Camilla, it was a confrontation with a past she could not control, a moment where the narrative she had helped shape collided violently with allegations that could redefine her legacy. For the public, it was a rare glimpse into the inner workings of a family long shrouded in secrecy, where power, influence, and history intersected with tragedy, speculation, and morality. The tension, emotion, and stakes combined to create a story that transcended mere scandal, touching on questions of ethics, loyalty, and the human capacity for both compassion and deception. As the introduction drew to a close, it became clear that this was only the beginning. The courtroom drama, though already intense, promised revelations, conflicts, and confrontations that would challenge perceptions, evoke deep emotions, and perhaps, for the first time, provide clarity on a tragedy that had haunted the world for decades. The players were revealed, the stakes outlined, and the narrative of secrecy and consequence set in motion. Viewers and readers alike were left with a sense of anticipation, knowing that what followed would not only be gripping, but potentially transformative for the understanding of one of the most infamous nights in modern history. The introduction, dense with tension, narrative depth, and emotional resonance, set the stage for an intricate and explosive exploration of truth, deception, and accountability. It drew the audience into the heart of the story, established the stakes, and created a visceral connection to both the accuser and the accused. The foundation was laid. The courtroom would serve as the arena, history as the judge, and the world as witness to a drama that promised to reveal truths long obscured, challenge assumptions, and redefine the narrative of a life, a death, and the secrets in between. The courtroom had settled into a tense, almost oppressive silence. Every eye was fixed on the central figure, Queen Camilla, whose presence, though composed in appearance, radiated an undercurrent of fear and anxiety. Cameras flashed sporadically, capturing her every movement, every subtle twitch of an eyelid, every faint tightening of her jaw. She sat rigidly in her chair, the leather-gloved hands clasped together on her lap, as if holding on to some invisible lifeline, while Prince Edward, his demeanor calm, yet resolute, paced slowly at the front of the room. The air between them was charged, heavy with the weight of unspoken truths, years of speculation, and the crushing reality that the events of 30 years ago were being dissected, piece by piece, under the unforgiving gaze of the public and the press. The judge's gavel struck sharply, cutting through the murmurs that had begun to ripple through the room. "We will come to order," the judge commanded, the voice both authoritative and measured, establishing the gravity of the proceedings. It was clear from the outset that this was not going to be a standard case. The allegations leveled against Camilla were unprecedented in their severity, suggesting that a woman who had long been a symbol of royal composure and strategic thinking may have played an active role in events that led to the death of Princess Diana. Edward began by methodically presenting communications intercepted from sources connected to media networks, detailing the ways in which Diana's movements had been tracked on the night of her fatal car chase. Each piece of evidence was laid out with painstaking clarity: times, locations, and interactions that pointed to a pattern of deliberate orchestration. The documents suggested that Camilla, leveraging her influence and connections, had relayed information regarding Diana's whereabouts to paparazzi, creating an environment in which photographers could anticipate her every move. The narrative painted a picture of relentless surveillance, a tragic inevitability carefully constructed by a network of influence and secrecy. As Edward spoke, the courtroom reacted in waves. Some leaned forward in disbelief, gripping the edges of their seats, while others exchanged furtive glances, whispering to one another with the kind of incredulity that only comes when long-held assumptions are being shattered in real time. The press, ever vigilant, captured every word, every pause, every calculated inflection, knowing that what was being revealed was not just news, but history in motion. Camilla's face, once a mask of control and authority, began to betray subtle signs of strain. Her lips pressed tightly together, and for the briefest moments, her eyes darted toward the gallery, as if seeking reassurance, a lifeline, or perhaps some escape from the unrelenting scrutiny. Edward's testimony continued with a focus on the broader implications of these actions. It was not merely that Diana had been pursued relentlessly. The evidence suggested that the pursuit had been facilitated and possibly orchestrated in a way that escalated the danger she faced. By ensuring that paparazzi were constantly aware of her location, by manipulating the flow of information, and by creating circumstances in which her movements were predictable, Camilla had, according to Edward, contributed to a situation that spiraled tragically out of control. The details were harrowing. Chase sequences reconstructed from surveillance footage, eyewitness testimonies corroborating the relentless presence of photographers, and communication logs indicating coordination among multiple parties to ensure Diana could not escape observation. The courtroom, though physically still, seemed to vibrate with the emotional weight of these revelations. Every word hung in the air, every document laid bare, every timeline reconstructed with meticulous attention to detail, created a suffocating tension. Journalists outside were already framing the narrative for a public desperate for answers, dissecting every nuance, every facial expression, every flicker of emotion displayed by Camilla as she absorbed the testimony. Social media erupted in real time, speculation running rampant, the public divided between shock, outrage, and disbelief. For decades, Diana's death had been mourned as a tragic accident, a cruel twist of fate. Now, the allegations suggested an element of human orchestration that challenged the very foundation of that narrative. Edward did not shy away from highlighting the ethical and moral dimensions of the case. "What we are discussing here," he said, his voice steady but imbued with an undeniable gravity, "is not simply a matter of historical record. It is a question of accountability, of understanding the human choices that led to irreversible consequences. Diana's life was precious, her freedom and autonomy violated not just by the relentless pursuit of media, but by deliberate acts of coordination that endangered her. We owe it to her memory, and to the truth, to examine these actions without prejudice or avoidance." His words resonated throughout the room, reverberating in the minds of those present, underscoring the magnitude of the allegations and the ethical imperative to confront them directly. The evidence Edward presented was complemented by expert testimonies from media analysts, security specialists, and former royal aides who had observed the patterns of Diana's movements and the behavior of photographers over the years. These experts detailed the complex mechanisms by which paparazzi were informed, how information flowed through informal networks, and how Diana's schedule, though seemingly private, had been susceptible to external influence. Their accounts were technical, precise, and yet profoundly compelling, illustrating the depth of surveillance and the meticulous planning that allegedly underpinned the events of that fateful night. Each expert, though careful with their words, painted a picture of an environment in which Diana was relentlessly monitored, a space where her every decision, movement, and encounter was vulnerable to exposure and exploitation. Camilla's response, though measured, could not escape the scrutiny of those in attendance. She remained silent for long stretches, absorbing the testimony, occasionally consulting with her legal counsel, and maintaining a posture that suggested careful calculation. Yet, subtle tells betrayed her inner turmoil. A fleeting tremor of the hand, a momentary tightening of the jaw, and eyes that occasionally betrayed a flicker of panic or despair. The public had long viewed her as a figure of strategic poise, capable of navigating the complex dynamics of royalty and media with finesse. Here, in the courtroom, stripped of ceremonial power and public adulation, she was confronted with allegations that struck at the heart of her reputation, her ethics, and her moral standing. The narrative took a particularly gripping turn when Edward introduced a timeline of interactions that directly linked Camilla to the dissemination of Diana's movements. Each entry was supported by correspondence, phone records, and eyewitness accounts. The precision of the timeline suggested deliberate planning, raising questions about motive and intent. Why would a member of the royal family, intimately connected to Diana, take actions that would place her in such peril? The courtroom collectively grappled with this question, the weight of the moral and historical implications pressing down on every observer. Edward did not leave the audience to speculate. He meticulously explained the context. He detailed the dynamics of the royal household at the time, the complicated web of personal relationships, jealousy, ambition, and long-standing tensions that created a volatile environment. He spoke of alliances, rivalries, and interpersonal conflicts, all converging in a narrative that suggested Diana had become ensnared in a complex interplay of power, influence, and manipulation. The goal was not merely to indict Camilla as an individual, but to illustrate how systemic pressures, combined with deliberate actions, created conditions that contributed to the tragic outcome. By the time Edward concluded the first phase of his presentation, the courtroom had been transformed into a crucible of emotion, intellect, and scrutiny. The evidence had been laid bare, the narrative meticulously constructed, and the ethical and historical stakes clearly articulated. Camilla, who had long stood as a symbol of calculated composure and strategic acumen, now faced the unrelenting gaze of both the legal system and the world, forced to confront allegations that could irrevocably alter public perception of her character and her role in history. The silence that followed was deafening, filled with anticipation, reflection, and the unspoken understanding that what had been revealed was only the beginning of a story that would unfold with increasing intensity, complexity, and consequence. In this charged atmosphere, it became evident that the courtroom was not just a venue for legal proceedings. It was a stage upon which history, morality, and human drama converged. The stakes were monumental, the emotions raw, and the consequences potentially far-reaching. Every statement, every reaction, every nuance mattered, and the world was watching, collectively holding its breath as a narrative long buried in secrecy was brought into the unforgiving light of accountability. The stage was set for a trial that promised to redefine narratives, challenge assumptions, and confront one of the most enduring tragedies of the modern era with a rigor and intensity that history would not soon forget. Prince Edward approached the podium with a quiet determination that contrasted sharply with the charged atmosphere of the courtroom. His every movement was deliberate, each step measured, conveying a sense of purpose that resonated with everyone present. The weight of history pressed down on him, the ghosts of decades past seemingly hovering in the rafters, and yet he maintained a calm composure. There was a profound seriousness in his eyes, a mixture of sorrow, outrage, and unwavering commitment to the truth. This was not a performance for the media or the public. It was a moral reckoning, an attempt to confront the hidden forces and secret decisions that had shaped one of the most tragic nights in modern royal history. He began by addressing the court directly, his voice steady and clear. "What I am about to present is evidence that has remained hidden for far too long," he said. "Evidence that speaks not just to the events of that night, but to decisions made in secrecy that had irreversible consequences." The courtroom was silent, hanging on every word, aware that what was about to unfold could change public perception, rewrite historical narratives, and, perhaps most importantly, offer clarity to the many who had mourned Princess Diana without fully understanding the circumstances that led to her death. Edward's first exhibit was a series of meticulously compiled communications between key figures in the media and, allegedly, intermediaries linked directly to Camilla. The documents included emails, phone records, and handwritten notes, some of which had been recovered from long-forgotten archives. Each piece of evidence was presented with painstaking detail, establishing a clear timeline that suggested Diana's movements were being monitored with an extraordinary level of coordination. The dates, times, and locations were painstakingly aligned, showing patterns that could not be dismissed as coincidence. Edward highlighted each connection, carefully drawing the links between Camilla's known associates and the photographers who had been in relentless pursuit that fateful night. The court watched as Edward laid out the first major revelation, that on the evening of the fatal car chase in Paris, Camilla had allegedly provided information regarding Diana's planned movements to certain paparazzi networks. The details were precise: locations of restaurants, planned exits, routes, and even estimates of the duration of each stop. The evidence suggested that the photographers were able to anticipate Diana's every move, arriving in strategic locations moments before her arrival. The implication was chilling: a seemingly innocuous act of sharing information, when combined with the relentless pursuit by multiple photographers, had created conditions ripe for a catastrophic outcome. Edward paused for effect, allowing the magnitude of the evidence to sink in. The courtroom was filled with an almost palpable tension. Every person present seemed to be processing the gravity of the allegations. Even the seasoned journalists and legal professionals in attendance could not hide their shock. Some whispered quietly among themselves, while others scribbled notes, capturing the names, dates, and connections that formed the backbone of the case. Outside, news outlets were already drafting headlines, anticipating a story that would dominate the public conversation for weeks, if not months. He continued by introducing eyewitness testimonies that corroborated the documentary evidence. Former royal aides, security personnel, and even paparazzi themselves were brought forward to recount what they had observed and, in some cases, participated in. One former aide described how information about Diana's location seemed to flow unnaturally quickly from internal channels to external media networks. Another witness, a photographer who had been present in Paris on the night in question, admitted under oath that they had received information about Diana's route before she had even left her hotel. Each testimony added layers of credibility to Edward's case, painting a picture of a coordinated system that went beyond ordinary media speculation. The emotional impact of the evidence was undeniable. Camilla sat with her hands tightly clasped, her knuckles white, occasionally glancing toward her counsel with a mixture of concern and disbelief. The public gallery, filled with onlookers and members of the press, leaned forward, the room almost vibrating with anticipation. Each piece of evidence, each corroborating testimony, seemed to tighten the narrative around her, suggesting a deliberate orchestration that had contributed to Diana's peril. The tension was so thick that one could almost feel it pressing against the walls, a silent acknowledgement of the enormity of what was being revealed. Edward did not shy away from addressing the psychological implications of the actions he alleged. He explained how constant surveillance and the strategic leaking of information could create immense stress, fear, and a sense of being trapped. Diana, already under extraordinary public scrutiny, had her personal autonomy compromised in a manner that left her vulnerable. Edward's analysis was both clinical and empathetic, illustrating not just the mechanics of the alleged conspiracy, but its human impact. He drew upon expert testimony from psychologists who had studied the effects of relentless media attention, emphasizing that the fear, anxiety, and stress Diana experienced were not just natural consequences of fame, but were exacerbated by deliberate external manipulation. The courtroom grew increasingly tense as Edward presented audio recordings, some of which had been recovered from informal conversations among paparazzi and intermediaries linked to Camilla's social circles. In these recordings, subtle references to Diana's locations, planned movements, and schedules were discussed in a manner that suggested prior knowledge. The recordings were fragmented, occasionally obscured by background noise, yet the pattern was unmistakable. The jurors, the judge, and the spectators were all drawn into a narrative that seemed almost cinematic in its unfolding, a real-life drama of intrigue, secrecy, and tragedy. Edward then introduced a series of photographs, not just of Diana's movements, but of interactions between Camilla and individuals who had facilitated the flow of information. While none of the images explicitly depicted wrongdoing in isolation, when considered within the broader context, they formed a compelling narrative. The photographs showed meetings, subtle exchanges, and moments of private conversation that, when pieced together with the communications and testimonies, suggested a deliberate orchestration aimed at monitoring Diana. The visual evidence added a tangible, almost visceral layer to the case, bringing the abstract allegations into stark, undeniable clarity. The courtroom atmosphere shifted as Edward moved to the next component of his presentation, digital evidence. In a detailed and methodical fashion, he outlined metadata extracted from emails, messages, and archive files that traced the flow of information from Camilla's known contacts to media operatives. Each digital breadcrumb was analyzed, cross-referenced, and verified, demonstrating a consistent and purposeful pattern. The technical nature of this evidence lent a weighty credibility to Edward's claims, showing that this was not merely speculative or anecdotal, but grounded in verifiable, empirical data. As the presentation progressed, Edward highlighted the broader implications of the alleged coordination. He argued that while the pursuit of Diana by paparazzi had been widely recognized, the intentional facilitation of that pursuit by someone within her close circle represented a profound breach of trust and ethical responsibility. The act was not merely negligent or opportunistic. It was, according to Edward, a conscious decision that exposed Diana to extraordinary risk. He spoke with a quiet intensity, conveying both sorrow for the loss and a determined pursuit of truth, insisting that accountability was essential for historical clarity and moral responsibility. Camilla's demeanor began to show cracks as the narrative unfolded. Subtle signs of distress became more apparent: a brief tremor of the hand, a downward cast of the eyes, and a tightening of the jaw that suggested the internalization of mounting pressure. Observers noted these tells, interpreting them as evidence of the profound personal and reputational impact of the testimony. The juxtaposition of her composed public image with the evident strain under scrutiny created a dramatic tension that permeated the courtroom. Edward concluded this section of the presentation with a powerful statement, summarizing the evidence and the narrative it formed. The documents, testimonies, photographs, and digital records collectively tell a story that has remained hidden for decades, he said. It is a story of deliberate orchestration, of information leveraged to control and monitor, and of consequences that were tragically realized. We owe it to Diana, to history, and to truth itself to confront these actions openly and without fear. His words reverberated through the room, leaving a silence filled with reflection, shock, and the weight of historical reckoning. The impact of this presentation was not confined to the courtroom. Outside, journalists and media analysts were already dissecting every element, debating the implications, and speculating on the potential fallout. The public, many of whom had grown up with a narrative of Diana's death as a tragic accident, were now being confronted with the possibility of human orchestration behind the events. The social and cultural ramifications were immense, as centuries of public perception and royal mystique were challenged in a single, meticulously detailed narrative. Edward's presentation was not merely an accusation. It was a reconstruction of events designed to illuminate the hidden mechanisms of influence and control. By combining empirical evidence with human testimony, he created a multi-layered narrative that was as emotionally compelling as it was factually robust. The courtroom became a stage where history, morality, and accountability intersected, and the world watched with bated breath as a story long shrouded in secrecy began to unfold in full, dramatic detail. Camilla sat rigidly in her seat, the courtroom lights casting a stark glow across her face, highlighting every subtle shift in expression. The previous hours had been a relentless cascade of evidence, each piece meticulously presented by Prince Edward, building a narrative that seemed almost impossible to refute. The weight of the courtroom's attention pressed upon her. Every eye was fixed, every whisper suspended, as though the very walls themselves were listening. She had faced media scrutiny before, endured public judgment, and navigated the complex waters of royal life. But nothing had prepared her for this confrontation, this relentless public exposure in which past actions, hidden, speculative, or alleged. The tension in the room was electric as Camilla took a deep breath. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles whitening, betraying the tension she fought to conceal. She had spent years cultivating an image of composed dignity, the practiced poise of royalty masking the private anxieties that came with public life. But now, under the glaring scrutiny of legal examination and familial confrontation, that carefully maintained facade seemed fragile. A soft tremor in her fingers betrayed the human vulnerability that lay beneath the regal exterior. Her eyes, though focused on the front of the courtroom, darted briefly toward her legal counsel, seeking guidance and support in a sea of mounting accusations. The room fell into a tense silence as she began to speak, her voice at first barely above a whisper. Then, as if steeling herself for the weight of her own words, it grew stronger, firmer, resonant with controlled emotion. I have lived my life with the utmost respect for my family, for the monarchy, and for those I have come to know and care about, she said. I categorically deny any suggestion that I had knowledge of or involvement in actions that would harm Princess Diana. Her words, carefully measured, were an attempt to assert innocence and maintain credibility in the face of an avalanche of evidence that suggested otherwise. Each syllable carried the weight of defensive rationalization, as if by vocalizing denial, she could somehow reclaim the narrative that had shifted so dramatically under Edward's presentation. Yet, despite her composure, subtle signs of emotional strain became evident. Her eyes glistened, betraying the tension building within, and a faint quiver in her voice punctuated the sincerity, or perceived sincerity, of her statements. The courtroom, filled with media representatives, legal professionals, and spectators, watched intently, trying to parse the difference between genuine remorse, strategic defense, and fear-driven reaction. In the high-stakes theater of royal scandal, every gesture, every inflection, carried potential meaning and consequence, and Camilla was acutely aware of this reality. Her legal counsel stepped in to reinforce her narrative, presenting arguments designed to contextualize her actions, if not absolve them entirely. They emphasized that any communications or interactions she had with members of the media were, at the time, considered routine, part of the intricate web of public relations and media management that surrounded royalty. They argued that she could not reasonably be held responsible for the unpredictable actions of paparazzi, whose pursuit of public figures was often aggressive, independent, and at times, unlawful. The defense sought to shift the framing from deliberate orchestration to inadvertent consequence, painting her as a figure caught in a system she neither controlled nor fully anticipated. Camilla's defense also touched upon her historical position within the royal family, the complex interpersonal dynamics, and the pressures of living under constant public scrutiny. Counsel argued that the decisions she made, actions interpreted as complicity by some, were, in reality, attempts to navigate an environment fraught with competing loyalties, expectations, and responsibilities. They highlighted the psychological and social context of royal life, the constant surveillance, the scrutiny of every personal and professional choice, and the challenges of maintaining personal safety, reputation, and dignity amidst relentless public attention. In their narrative, Camilla was portrayed not as a manipulative orchestrator, but as a woman constrained by circumstance, attempting to manage her responsibilities as a royal while contending with external pressures that few could comprehend. Yet, the defense was not without challenges. Edward's presentation had woven together evidence, testimony, and timelines in a way that created a compelling, cohesive narrative of alleged orchestration and deliberate facilitation. Each digital record, email, and photograph introduced by Edward had been cross-referenced, dated, and corroborated by witnesses. The defense had to contend with the chilling precision of these revelations, and while they could offer alternative interpretations and context, the gravity of the sequence of events could not be dismissed entirely. It was a careful balancing act, defending her integrity while acknowledging the undeniable scrutiny and suspicion created by the presented evidence. The emotional intensity of Camilla's response became more pronounced as she recounted personal reflections on her relationship with Diana. Her voice softened, conveying regret, sorrow, and a profound sense of personal conflict. She spoke of the complexities of her position in Diana's life, the challenges of navigating a triad of personal, familial, and public expectations. She emphasized moments of empathy, attempting to humanize her narrative by acknowledging the emotional weight of events that had unfolded decades prior. Her account was detailed, interwoven with recollections of conversations, private reflections, and personal experiences that sought to convey authenticity and depth. Every story, every anecdote, was carefully chosen to evoke sympathy, understanding, and a reconsideration of her role in the tragic events. Throughout her testimony, Camilla also sought to address public perception directly, highlighting the role of media narratives in shaping collective understanding. She argued that the relentless cycle of reporting, speculation, and sensationalism had contributed to the mythologizing of her alleged complicity. Her counsel echoed this point, emphasizing the difficulty of disentangling public persona from private reality. By framing the narrative in terms of external pressures and media distortion, Camilla aimed to create a psychological buffer, arguing that much of the public's perception of her involvement was influenced by rumor, conjecture, and retrospective interpretation rather than demonstrable fact. Despite these efforts, the courtroom atmosphere remained charged. Observers noted the interplay of defensive composure and visible emotional strain, the subtle tension between vulnerability and strategic performance. Edward, seated across the room, observed with a measured detachment, aware that the presentation of evidence and the unfolding of Camilla's response would shape public understanding, familial dynamics, and historical interpretation. The courtroom became a space where narrative control, credibility, and emotional resonance intersected, each moment of testimony layered with implications for reputation, accountability, and moral judgment. Camilla's response was further complicated by the juxtaposition of past media representations and current courtroom scrutiny. Photographs, archived footage, and contemporaneous reports were interlaced with her testimony, creating a dynamic interplay between historical record and personal narrative. The defense sought to contextualize these artifacts, highlighting inconsistencies in reporting, misinterpretations, and the limitations of contemporary journalistic practices. In doing so, they attempted to shield Camilla from the full impact of the evidence presented by Edward, suggesting alternative interpretations while maintaining a focus on mitigating culpability. The court also considered expert testimony on media behavior, ethical considerations, and historical analysis. Scholars, media analysts, and royal historians were called to offer insight into the operational practices of paparazzi networks, the nature of royal media management, and the broader socio-political context. These experts provided frameworks that allowed for nuanced consideration of Camilla's actions, exploring the intersections of power, influence, and media interaction in high-profile public life. Their input underscored the complexity of assigning responsibility, acknowledging both agency and systemic factors in the events surrounding Diana's fatal encounter. As her defense progressed, Camilla demonstrated moments of raw emotion, reflecting the intense personal toll of public scrutiny, legal exposure, and historical judgment. She described nights of sleepless reflection, the burden of carrying accusations, and the weight of familial relationships strained under decades of rumor, speculation, and unspoken tension. These moments humanized her in the eyes of the court, offering glimpses into the emotional landscape of someone navigating extraordinary circumstances. The tension between vulnerability and resilience became a central theme of her narrative, shaping the perception of her testimony in profound ways. Toward the conclusion of her response, Camilla made a direct appeal to both the court and the public, emphasizing the importance of historical accuracy, fairness, and measured interpretation. She acknowledged the tragedy of Diana's death, expressing sorrow and empathy without conceding responsibility for alleged orchestration. Her words were deliberate, intended to resonate with a sense of moral reflection and emotional authenticity. "The loss we experienced was profound, and the pain remains," she stated softly, her voice carrying both grief and insistence on her perspective. "I hope that in the pursuit of truth, we can also recognize the complexity of human actions, the pressures of public life, and the need for fairness in understanding history." The courtroom remained silent as her final words echoed. There was a collective awareness that this moment was pivotal, that the unfolding narrative had shifted the focus from abstract speculation to direct confrontation of evidence, testimony, and human emotion. Every observer, from legal professionals to members of the press, felt the weight of the drama that had played out, recognizing that Camilla's defense, though composed, carefully constructed, and strategically delivered, had been tested against a detailed and emotionally compelling presentation of evidence. The moment Camilla's testimony concluded, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath, a collective pause that stretched on as if time itself had decided to linger on the significance of the revelations just delivered. Lawyers shifted in their seats, scribbling notes furiously, while journalists raised pens and cameras, capturing each microexpression, each flicker of emotion, each subtle gesture that could potentially define the public's perception. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that comes from witnessing a moment where history, scandal, and familial discord converge in a single space. Every individual present seemed acutely aware that they were observing not merely a courtroom proceeding, but an event with ramifications that would ripple through royal history, media narratives, and public consciousness alike. A murmur swept across the spectators' section, a mixture of disbelief and shock. Some covered their mouths instinctively, unable to process the enormity of the allegations and the defensive strategies laid out before them. Others leaned forward, elbows on knees, eyes wide, as though proximity could somehow bridge the chasm between comprehension and astonishment. Conversations that began in hushed tones quickly escalated into intense speculation, as witnesses exchanged interpretations of Camilla's tone, her body language, and the substance of her denials. There was a palpable sense that the balance of public perception had been delicately tilted, and that the courtroom itself had become a stage where the truth, or at least a compelling version of it, was being contested in real time. The reactions of the legal teams were no less charged. Edward's counsel maintained a composed demeanor, but subtle cues betrayed the weight of their own astonishment at the depth and specificity of Camilla's testimony. Notes were exchanged, whispered consultations occurred, and strategies were recalibrated in response to the unfolding dynamics. Each revelation, each defensive argument, required immediate processing and tactical consideration. Edward himself remained immobile, hands folded, his expression neutral but alert, scanning the courtroom and gauging reactions from every angle. The courtroom was both a theater and a battlefield, with narratives colliding and reputations hanging precariously in the balance. The media frenzy outside the courtroom escalated almost instantly. News outlets had been primed for the event, and as the word spread that Camilla had completed her testimony, reporters, photographers, and camera crews surged into position, capturing every possible image and soundbite. Satellite feeds, live blogs, and social media platforms erupted in real time, amplifying the tension within the room to a global scale. The narrative of Camilla's alleged coordination with paparazzi on the night of Diana's crash became a focal point, a sensational headline that dominated discussions across digital platforms, television broadcasts, and print publications. Each outlet, eager for immediacy, parsed her statements, analyzed her demeanor, and speculated on the implications, fueling a cascade of commentary, debate, and outrage. Inside the courtroom, the emotional temperature continued to rise. Witnesses who had been scheduled to testify next glanced nervously at the bench, aware that the unfolding drama had changed the tenor of their own expected narratives. Some rehearsed in their minds the points they would raise, recalibrating to address both the evidentiary framework and the charged emotional undercurrents that now defined the room. The judges and magistrates maintained an air of procedural authority, yet their subtle shifts in posture, the moments of thoughtful pause, and the occasional exchange of glances revealed that even the most experienced adjudicators were grappling with the profound weight of the testimony and the ensuing reactions. Observers noted the complex interplay between human emotion, historical context, and media representation. The courtroom had become a microcosm of public discourse, where every expression, every phrase, and every reaction was subject to scrutiny. Camilla's composure, which had been both strategic and emotionally resonant, was contrasted sharply against the palpable shock of the spectators and the measured intensity of Edward's demeanor. Analysts would later describe the scene as a collision of narrative forces, where history, personal accountability, and public perception converged in a highly charged environment, creating a dynamic that was as unpredictable as it was compelling. As whispers continued, the tension was punctuated by the arrival of new witnesses and experts, each entering with their own documentation, prepared statements, and carefully considered testimony. The sequence of events that had been meticulously laid out by Edward now needed to be addressed in detail by corroborating voices. Photographers captured moments as individuals exchanged documents, conferred quietly, and positioned themselves in anticipation of their turn to speak. The courtroom, once a structured arena of procedure, had transformed into a charged ecosystem, alive with the energy of human emotion, historical reckoning, and the high stakes of reputation management. Legal analysts present in the gallery commented on the remarkable intensity of the moment. Some noted the rarity with which a royal figure would testify in such a public, direct manner, particularly regarding allegations of complicity in events as consequential and tragic as Diana's death. They highlighted the delicate balancing act required. The need to present a credible, defensible narrative while simultaneously navigating the scrutiny of a global audience, the judgment of peers, and the moral weight of historical interpretation. The courtroom, in this sense, became not just a site of legal contestation, but a space where the performative and the substantive intersected in ways that carried profound implications for both historical memory and contemporary perception. The human element of shock was further amplified by the interactions among family members present. The tension between Camilla and Edward, though largely mediated through legal channels, carried an emotional resonance that was unmistakable. Observers noted subtle shifts in posture, fleeting expressions of incredulity, and moments where the veneer of civility threatened to crack under the weight of accusation, defense, and historical grievance. The dynamic between accuser and accused, framed within the broader context of familial relationships and public expectation, intensified the emotional stakes and underscored the complexity of navigating personal, legal, and public dimensions simultaneously. Media outlets outside continued to report in rapid succession, often overlaying live footage with expert commentary, speculative timelines, and archival material. Each analysis aimed to contextualize Camilla's responses, juxtaposing her denials against the evidence presented by Edward. Social media platforms became echo chambers of interpretation, where snippets of testimony, expressions of shock, and real-time reactions were amplified, debated, and shared. The public, now deeply engaged, formed rapid judgments, discussed implications, and speculated on the potential outcomes, creating a feedback loop that reinforced the intensity of the courtroom's atmosphere. The media frenzy effectively extended the courtroom's influence into every home, office, and public space where access to digital platforms was available, making the proceedings not merely legal events, but global spectacles. The emotional crescendo within the courtroom reached another peak when Edward's legal team requested a brief recess to organize additional evidence and prepare witnesses for cross-examination. The motion was granted, and the room temporarily emptied, leaving behind a charged stillness that contrasted sharply with the prior chaos. In this brief pause, the weight of the proceedings seemed to settle, almost tangibly, upon every individual who remained. Legal professionals reviewed notes and testimony. Journalists prepared updates for their respective platforms, and spectators reflected on the intensity of what had transpired. Even in this moment of relative quiet, the reverberations of shock, tension, and emotional engagement persisted, a testament to the profound impact of the unfolding narrative. As proceedings resumed, the focus shifted subtly, with cameras and attention gravitating toward the next sequence of witnesses poised to address specific elements of Edward's claims. The energy of the courtroom, however, remained charged, carrying forward the emotional intensity established during Camilla's testimony. Every statement, gesture, and reaction continued to be scrutinized, analyzed, and disseminated, contributing to a living narrative that spanned the courtroom walls and extended into the global public consciousness. The interplay of shock, tension, and media amplification had transformed the courtroom into a crucible of historical reckoning, human emotion, and the relentless pursuit of truth, whether perceived, interpreted, or fully realized. As the courtroom doors swung open once again, the air seemed heavier, charged with anticipation and the weight of history in the making. Everyone knew that this segment of the trial would delve into the crux of Edward's allegations, the meticulously gathered evidence pointing toward Camilla's alleged coordination with paparazzi on the night of Diana's tragic crash. The atmosphere was electric, a mix of tension, curiosity, and dread, as the spectators, legal teams, and media personnel prepared to confront a narrative that could reshape decades of royal legacy. Cameras clicked, pens scribbled,